Welcome to the Culture Lab. I'm your host, Aga Bayer. This podcast helps you turn your company culture into rocket fuel for meaningful growth. It explores how we can make the word work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging. It looks at how we can build remarkable cultures that scale as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing.
The big thing to focus on there is that these are functions. These are functions that any entity needs to have as it moves through the world. It has to have some function, some system for connecting itself, which is safety. It has to have some system for making decisions and processing information, and that's vulnerability. And it has to have some system for direction, for finding its way through the world, and that's purpose.
Welcome to episode 87 of the Culture Lab podcast. This episode is brought to you by Culture Brain, a one-of-a-kind global community for leaders and culture champions who want to learn new ways of cultivating remarkable cultures at scale in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. The Culture Brain community is where we come together to answer some pretty darn hard, ungoogleable questions about culture. And our members get to participate in things like weekly huddles, masterclasses, flash mastermind groups, and talks from world-class experts on culture. And you know many of these experts from this podcast. But most importantly, we facilitate deep peer-to-peer connections. Because making work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, it's definitely not a task for a single person. It requires tapping into the collective wisdom of bold, kind, and curious culture leaders who are on a mission to redefine and, frankly, decrapify work. So, if this sounds like something you'd like to be a part of, check it out at tiny.1/culturebrain. And don't worry, you don't have to write it down. There is a link in the show notes. If you've been listening to the show for a while, you've probably been convinced by our previous guests to read the New York Times bestselling book, The Culture Code. It was written by my guest today, Dan Coyle. Case in point, this is what Adam Grant said about The Culture Code. Daniel Coyle has produced a truly brilliant, mesmerizing read that demystifies the magic of great groups. It blows all other books on culture right out of the water. So what Dan did with Culture Code was basically go inside some of the world's most successful organizations, including the US Navy SEAL Team 6, IDEO, and the San Antonio Spurs, and reveal what made them tick. And he identified 3 key skills that generate cohesion and cooperation, and explained how diverse groups learn to function with a single mind. The book was published in 2017, and while it was a huge hit, it also left people hungry for more, especially for how to strengthen the 3 pillars that Dan has identified in the Culture Code: safety, vulnerability, and purpose. And so when the pandemic struck, Dan decided to give us what we needed and write a sequel to the Culture Code. The book is called The Culture Playbook, and it's basically a workbook designed to build team skills and to strengthen cultures. It contains 60 simple actions that leaders can take to help their teams be more successful, and it guides them through a series of exercises that they can do with their teams. We discussed some of them in this interview, so tune in and enjoy.
Yeah, my name is Daniel Coyle. I'm a writer, researcher, and I've spent the last, 15 or 20 years in the area of performance and what makes individuals extremely talented and successful, and also what makes certain groups talented, successful, thriving. I spend my time, I live part of the year in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, and I live in summers in my home state of Alaska. So we sort of bounce back and forth. Which gives me kind of a long distance view on these issues and on the whole world.
That sounds amazing. Alaska sounds absolutely amazing.
Mhm.
So then I've told you already before we started recording, I really can't tell you how thrilled I am to have you on the show. Because first of all, I don't know anyone who listens to this show and who hasn't read the Culture Code. And so you only imagine how thrilled our listeners are going to be to learn that you have a new book coming out in May. What is it called and why did you decide to write it?
It's called the Culture Playbook. And after the Culture Code came out several years ago, there was a call. I got many signals that people were hungry for kind of a more actionable, simple, practical guide. If the Culture Code contains a fair amount of theory, sort of, I would say, weighted more toward understanding the stories and building the model, the theoretical model for building culture. There was a call for, I want a cookbook. I want a recipe book. I just want the
Mm-hmm.
recipes. Tell me how to do it. And so when COVID started, I started writing it. And I originally thought it was going to be a fairly simple process. Oh, I'll just compile all these actions. And as I went through it, I realized that it's not enough just to sort of list the actions or list the recipes. Culture is complex and it really requires more of a conversational approach, more of a reflective approach. And so the book I ended up writing, The Culture Playbook, is sort of a workbook and it's meant for people to do it together with their teams to do that act that, we do so rarely, but that is so powerful where you get together with your team and reflect.
Mm-hmm.
How should we be together? Where are we going? What is working? What isn't working? It's sort of a workbook designed to build team skills and to strengthen cultures. And some of those actions are very simple and short. Think of them as like hygiene, right? Good hygiene habits. And some of them are deeper and more involved. You might think of those like exercises.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is that between this sort of hygiene approach and this sort of exercise thing, that you end up having a plan to strengthen cultural health, strengthen and monitor it.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it kind of evolved into. We went from a cookbook into something much more interactive and much deeper.
I love it. And I have to say that actually that interactive part was my favorite part of the book. So I really enjoyed just going through the process and the exercises that you suggest that the readers engage in with their teams. Some of them are quite reflective, but some of them require action. And I think this is so, so fabulous. And I've started doing this for my team and I can definitely see huge value in going through these. I'm super keen to dive into some of the actions and the
Yes.
recipe and the hygiene and the exercises that you suggest. But before we do that, we have this question that we kick off every interview with. And the question is, what were the early cultural influences that shaped you as a person?
Oh, what a cool question. That's such a nice thing to explore. When I think very deeply about it, I think of two things. One is that I was born with three boys in my family. I was right in the middle of these three kind of competitive boys. And so I think my interest uh, sort of in the culture of performance and talent was deeply rooted in this survival experience
I was going to
that I
say it
went
was
through.
probably all about survival, right?
Exactly. I had to figure this out or else, And so
Uh-huh.
that's one big influence, that sort of culture. But the other culture I would point to is that of Alaska. Alaska
Mm.
became a state in 1950s. It is really a frontier. And we lived there at the end, we spent time in a remote cabin off the grid. And that does a couple things culturally. I think it pulls you out of this everyday world of technology and product. It zooms you out to see things
Mm-hmm.
from a wider perspective. But it also puts you keenly in touch with the power of relying on each other and how essential that is when you need to borrow things, when you need to survive bad weather, to be in the conditions that are much closer to the conditions that humanity evolved in, where we're being sort of connected in a productive, cohesive group was essential. It kind of gave me a view and an approach to kind of be looking for those things and appreciating those things, both in my own life and in my work.
Yeah, this is so true, right? I think that the lives that probably the majority of our listeners live predominantly in urban environments have stripped away that need to rely on each other. And so I guess we don't really get a lot of experiences in early lives and our professional lives where it would be so incredibly fundamental So I can absolutely appreciate how that would shape you and how that would put a spotlight on that dynamic, and what makes groups effective and what makes you feel like you belong to a group. What does it feel like to rely on others for survival?
Yes.
I guess whether you think that might be the reason why a lot of times we hear that the most effective teams and the most bonded teams are in a military environment or other environments where indeed it is a matter of survival. So that's first element that you have mentioned, but also super important, being very bonded and relying on others for everything that you might need in the moment.
Yes, and you tune into the power of that, and also kind of the simplicity of that can happen, that we're built to crave it and we're built to do it. And that's what that sort of brings home for me, is the fact that we do live in these very modern worlds where that seems very far away. But the gateway to that situation, into that mindset, into those relationships is often much shorter and easier and simpler than we think. It can be as simple as asking someone for help, or
Mhm.
being open about what you don't know. That it can sort of click into this older way of being together, and this more kind of connected way of being together. And so I guess you're making me realize that those gateways, which I guess in some way what the book is about, building those gateways, are closer and more convenient and more accessible than we might otherwise think.
Yeah. So let's talk about these gateways or the three pillars, perhaps, of thriving cultures, because in the Culture Playbook, you do talk about them, and they are safety, vulnerability, and purpose.
Hmm.
I wonder, just to set a little bit of context for our conversation, could you speak to why these three things are so incredibly important for building successful teams?
The big thing to focus on there is that these are functions. These are functions that any entity needs to have as it moves through the world. It has to have some function, some system for connecting itself, which is safety. It has to have some system for making decisions and processing information, and that's vulnerability. And it has to have some system for direction, for finding its way through the world, and that's purpose.
Hmm.
When we normally think about culture, the normal mental model we have for culture, the traditional mental model we have for culture, is that it's got all these sort of abstractions in it, right? It's sort of like the personality of a group. We think of it as like it's in the group's DNA, it's in their identity. And we use words like values and purpose and mission and cohesion and honesty and all these words. And really, when you strip all that away, all those abstractions away, beneath it, you've got these core functions of connection, of information sharing, and of direction. And you can kind of conceptualize these as connection is sort of like the circulatory system, the heart pumping the blood and delivering the energy to the whole organism. And you have sort of vulnerability as this information system where people are being transparent about what's really happening and creating shared understanding and situational awareness. That's sort of like the brain. And purpose is sort of like the eyes. How do you know where to go? How do you know where true north is? How do you know what's an obstacle and what's something that you should completely ignore? That's your system, of your visual system, and that's how purpose functions. So this concept, which I sort of rooted in the scientific research and also rooted in my visits to the top performing cultures on the planet, is kind of like if you x-ray any group on the planet that is very high performing and has a very good culture, you're going to see these three functions. They're using
Yeah.
safety to connect, they're using vulnerability to process information, and they're using purpose to find direction. And the visual that I always go back to, that I think captures it, is you can kind of picture a flock of birds flying through a landscape. They're staying together. They're not drifting off or fracturing apart. They're situationally aware. They're moving through these obstacles, moving toward a goal. And that's the visual that captures those sorts of functions. And I think in this era we're living in now, those functions become even more vital as COVID and the changes in the generational impacts that we're having as new social contracts are being formed around work and technology and hybrid work and social justice. All of these forces are causing cultures and successful groups to continually get better at connecting, get better at being transparent, get better at sharing information, get better at handling direction. So the last 2 years, if they've taught us anything, it's that these three pillars are more important than ever.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we are really going through a completely uncharted territory. And so using this imagery and the metaphor of a flock of birds, I can only imagine how important, how much more important all of that stuff is when you are actually going somewhere that you've never been before, and things are being redefined and reestablished and rethought by people. And so we really need to figure out how to go through that uncharted territory and reach our destination, which hopefully for the majority of our listeners is creating a workplace where people can do the best work of their careers and where they can reach their business goals.
I love that.
Yeah, that's what it's all about. So I love the fact that you responded to your readers' request to write something that is practical. You call it a cookbook as a first intention. I love this because that has always been my experience as well. And I know that for a lot of our listeners, what they look for in our shows is actionable insights.
Yeah.
And so I want to dive straight into, what can people do to strengthen these three pillars? And what's better place to start than building safety? I think we all know these days that psychological safety and safety in general is probably the number one factor that is absolutely necessary to have in place if you want innovation, if you want high performance, if you want diversity. So I'm curious, you have so many actions that leaders can take and teams can take to create safety. Do you have any favorites, actions or exercises that the teams can do to really make a difference to the sense of safety that people experience on the team?
You bet. One of my favorites it was taught to me by a Navy SEAL commander, and it is keep an open face. As he pointed out, your face is like a door. It's got two settings. It's got closed, which we know what that looks like. Our attention is narrow, spotlit. Our brow is down. We're focused on what's in front of us. Or open. And the muscle above your eyebrows is called your frontalis muscle. It has no survival function. It is only for social signaling.
Wow.
And when we raise our eyebrows, it is to communicate excitement, interest, engagement, and that enthusiasm, that moment, especially as we communicate through these silly little glass windows more and more, paying attention to your facial expression can be one of the simplest things you can do to create that sense of connection and listening. Another one that I really think is powerful is sending the 2-line email. The 2-line email, this is a technique used by Laszlo Bock, who used to head up people analytics at Google. And it's when you send an email to your team, and it's very short. It just says, please tell me one thing you'd like me to keep doing and one thing you'd like me to stop doing. It's a really short email and a really large signal of connection saying, help me get better. And what you find when you send that and have conversations following it up, you'll find it becomes a bit contagious in your group, that a lot of people find that they want that. And finally, I guess another sort of thing about safety that's really pertinent to our moment today is normalizing conversations about mental health. Normalizing.
Yeah.
If a coworker came in with a broken ankle, you would notice, and mental health is no different. And so this idea, I think that as we work in these more remote environments, more hybrid, that we need to normalize that. Some groups have already taken a step. Some leaders at Genentech posted some stories of their own mental health struggles, talking about depression, anxiety, all the usual stuff. And they put it under hashtag Let's Talk. And they created a conversation about this. So those are three that come quickly to mind. But in all of these, as you do, there's a concept too that it's a little overarching that may apply too, and that is to embrace deep fun. As leaders, people want to bring people in the environment, and there was a long tradition of saying, well, let's make the workplace fun, right? Let's have ping pong tables and let's provide treats and let's do all that stuff. Well, that can be helpful, but the truth is that fun comes in two categories. There's shallow fun, which is pleasurable things like ping pong tables and Nerf guns and great snacks. And there's deep fun. And deep fun is the process of really owning the work experience, really taking control over how you're going to work together. I saw a nice example of that. There's a company in Michigan that decided to send out a team to locate the best coffee on the planet and bring it back to the group. And they, what's the best bean? What's the best roaster? What's the best machine? What's the best milk? Bringing all this back and delivering it. And there it is in the office. And this idea of having control, not assigning jobs to people, but coming together as a group and saying, how can we make life here better?
Hmm.
Maybe that's picking out some exercise equipment to put in the office, or maybe that's changing policy.
Yeah.
The U.S. women's soccer team does a nice job of that. They design their own cleats and they put the names of their heroes on the back of their jerseys, and they fight for equal pay. So there is this deep ownership that I think smart groups seek to create.
I love that. And I think it really taps into this deep, deep, deep human need to have a sense of agency. And, especially given that people spend so much time at work, when you know that you can be involved in making things better, well, I think first you feel that you can make a difference. And also, I think what's important, it taps into so many needs actually, because it probably also taps into the need to have meaning and know that you are part of something bigger than you. Because obviously, if you improve things for your colleagues, you are doing something for others as well. So I really, really love this. And it's super practical as well, because I think very often these initiatives are led by HR or senior leadership teams. But the reality is that they don't always know what will make things better in the workplace. So
That's right.
crowdsourcing is a genius idea.
It is. And if you just ask people, I think I call it the magic wand question in the book, but just asking people, hey, if you could change one thing about the way we work together, what would it be? Just one thing of
Yeah,
life around here. What would it be?
it's one of my favorite questions.
And the answers you get from that can be the source for finding a location of deep fun.
Yeah, totally, totally. And I love that you mentioned fun. I have these three pillars that I use around culture as well. And the first one is fun.
Ah,
I love this idea of shallow and deep fun. And I also, another element that I use in my pillars is this element of fun that comes from doing work that is actually enjoyable. So it's about
yeah,
crafting your own job and making sure that people can do work that they energizes them and that they can energize as well. So we're super aligned around this. And recently, I have also discovered the importance from the scientific viewpoint. I don't know if you are familiar with the research and with the work, the importance of humor in the workplace
yeah,
and how
right.
important it is for our mental health, how important it is for high performance, interestingly, leadership impact. Have you heard of it? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I could not agree more. And it is such a tell when I was going around to visit these top performing cultures. I was going all over the place, looking at
Hmm.
tech businesses and sports and education. And you would always, that's a tell. That was absolutely a tell that there is this sense of laughter. And we sometimes think of laughter as like, oh, that's just sort of a fun ingredient, like some frosting on the cake.
Yeah.
In fact, I think it relates more to the deep approach. In these places, there's a playfulness.
Hmm.
There's a playfulness that is central to the work. And I love that this podcast is called the Culture Lab because there is this playful laboratory atmosphere in these places where there's a sense, hey, we're going to try some stuff together. Some of it's going to work, some of it's not going to work. There's always room for a silly idea, there's
Yeah.
always room to make a joke. And what humor speaks to is the spaciousness of the psychological space in these places and the safety that they've created. Because what is humor if not voice, right? It's people
Right.
using their voice to elevate the mood and to lift the energy. And if you're in a place that is grim and that where
Yeah.
people don't feel comfortable laughing or making a joke, I think that is a massive indicator that that culture has some serious room to grow.
Totally. And when you think about stand-up comedians and what they do and what are the key elements of humor, and I see the same humor and the same techniques being used by great leaders, they will actually speak the truth. And that's why it's funny
That's right.
because they,
That's
right.
right.
And so I think it's such a wonderful sign that you do have safety within a team, because when people can use humor, it means they can speak the truth and they can bring some levity to it, but it's okay to be honest. It's okay to be truthful. And I think that's absolutely a really, really important sign of whether it's a healthy culture or not. I couldn't agree more. I love it.
And to your point, we've seen that in the example that you give in Zelenskyy over and over again,
Hmm.
right? One of the
Mm.
truth
Yeah,
and spaciousness and everything. It's just amazing how he's lived that.
so true. Since it's such a topical topic and the war in Ukraine. What are your thoughts on that? And what are you seeing? And given your work and given your research?
There's so many things to explore there that would be endless, but I'll just point out one small thing that I think is worth noting. People are wondering how a comedian could become, such an inspiring wartime leader.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of reasons for that. But I think part of it, we've talked about here, this sort of sensitivity to audience, this ability to deliver a message, this ability to tell the truth. One of the truths he did early on, or referred to early on, was when, right after he was brought into office, he had everyone who worked in government, they all had a picture of the president on the wall. That's what you do, right? You have a picture of the president. He asked them to take those down and to put up pictures of their family, right? Really
Yeah,
simple thing, really simple thing. But when you talk about a signal of purpose, a signal of connection, a signal of vulnerability as well, like it is no accident that he has done such a good job, because from the beginning he understood, had a keen sense of how can I build a windshield? How can I create connection? What signals can I send? And he's done a brilliant job of sending.
totally. We had Timothy Clark on the show a few episodes ago, and he's one of the experts on psychological safety. And he talked about the importance of not overemphasizing status if you want to create a psychologically safe workplace. And that example that you have just given, I think it's such a great example of saying, hey, I'm not God. I definitely don't belong on this wall. Who belongs here is your family, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And companies still have, the best parking spots reserved for the leaders and so on and so forth. So this is, I suppose, something to think about.
100%. It's such an easy thing to do. That's the other thing about some of this stuff. It's not hard. It's very, very simple. It's
Mhm.
right there. It's just the behaviors are what count, not the words, the behaviors.
hmm And I love this term that you use, signaling, because I find it such an accurate term. So you really want to signal. You don't want to be too explicit sometimes, because that's not the point. It's almost like infantilizing the whole thing, but just signaling that it's safe, signaling that it's okay to be vulnerable, signaling where we are going. It's simple, but when it comes to implementation, it can be quite challenging. And so I want to talk more about what are other things that our listeners can do, and perhaps moving to the second pillar.
Yeah.
This is this huge conversation right now on vulnerability and its importance. So again, I wonder, for our listeners who are listening and thinking, okay, so how do I signal vulnerability in a way that is okay? Because sometimes it's
Yeah.
hard to know, like, where do you
It's
draw the
hard.
line? You definitely
That's
don't
right.
want to freak out your team. Like, oh my God, she's losing it. And, it's just too much.
Yeah. She doesn't have any idea.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Now, I think vulnerability is a very powerful and big word, and some of the misunderstandings about it are that, vulnerability means I need to tell everyone about my childhood, or
Mhm.
vulnerability needs to be very emotional. But that's not true. The type of vulnerability that works is usually vulnerability around learning.
Mm.
It was a great example of that at Pixar, actually, about 20 years ago. A bunch of engineers at Pixar were working on a problem, and the boss, Ed Catmull, came and was watching them quietly. And of course, they got a little nervous. The boss is sitting there watching. And then, right before he left, he leaned to one of them and he said, "Hey, excuse me, but when you guys are done there, could you come up to my office and teach me how to do that?"
Wow.
Just an extraordinary moment. And I actually talked to the engineer who now works at Google. It was almost 20 years ago, and he was telling the story like it was yesterday. It was an extraordinary signal of wanting to learn. It wasn't about
Mhm.
Ed Catmull saying, "Oh, here's what I'm afraid of," or whatever. It's just expressing real interest in seeing what's really happening and sharing what's really happening and getting a little bit better.
Yeah.
And I think there's another thing going on in the culture right now that I just heard about that is so strange. I feel like I have to mention it, which is sort of this level of fake vulnerability that
Mhm.
some people are realizing that vulnerability is powerful. And I just talked to somebody at a tech company who told me they knew that media consultants were encouraging CEOs to cry on camera and actually
Oh my
coaching them to do
God.
so, to cry. The
What?
tears of the oligarch. Right, exactly.
Wait. Is this real?
He said it was real. He said he convinced me that it was real. I'm still looking for the
Wow.
evidence, but he said, I've been in meetings. I've seen the consultant. I've seen them do that again, but see if you can well up a little bit would be the advice. And so This is, of course, the exact this is just pure manipulation, and this is
Mm-hmm.
using cheap emotional stunts that they're calling vulnerability. Actual vulnerability is not fake tears in a press conference. It is when you say, I don't know, when you say, hey,
Mm-hmm.
I think I screwed that up. It's when you hold an idea exchange, or when you have an AAR, an after action review, and you talk about where you
Mm-hmm.
messed up and had somebody else mess up. It's around creating situational awareness around what's really happening. And the real power of vulnerability is not in a one way transmission, it's in a vulnerability loop. It's when you have two or more people circle up and just sort of tell each other the truth with warmth and with candor.
Mm. I want to double click on that. But before we go there, I love this definition that Brene Brown has of vulnerability, which is, well, I don't actually remember. I'm probably going to butcher the actual definition, but she talks about the fact that actually it's courage to do something in spite of the risk that it's not going to work out. So it's like you do something and you don't know what necessarily what the impact is going to be, or you don't know how others are going to react to that. And so actually it's a true testament to courage. And it has nothing to do with fake tears for sure.
That's right. That's
I'm
right. That's right.
so shocked. Yeah.
And when you get hard feedback, the hardest thing to do is to kind of embrace that feedback, embrace that
Hmm.
we have a defensive response that comes up right away. But
Yeah.
in good cultures, what you have people is not just sort of not shooting the messenger, but actually embracing
Hugging.
the messenger and
Yeah.
saying, thank
Yeah.
you, right? I really appreciate that,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
that will open up the doorway for you to get more truth later. And that's what
Hmm.
groups need to have to survive is this real sense of what's happening, not what they hope is happening, or what they think is happening.
Totally. So let's double click on what you have mentioned earlier, not being brutally honest, but learning to be warmly candid. What's the difference between the two? And then how do we become warmly candid?
Yes, there's a tendency, and it's mostly among men, but when they talk about feedback and they say, well, look, we're going to be honest with each other, and they always use that same phrase. They say, I'm going to be brutally honest with you, right? I'm going to be brutally honest. The problem is that when you're
Now, just when you say that, I want to hide under my table, literally.
yes, me too.
That's my reaction
Right. Because
when I
when you're
hear these
brutally
words.
honest, you end up creating a culture of brutality. Like, that's what happens, right? And might feel good for the giver at one time. It feels terrible for the receiver. Brutal honesty, it's better for name for warm candor. Warm candor is two signals at once. It is connection and truth at once. And I saw a beautiful example of this at a restaurant owned by Danny Meyer. It's in New York. Some of your listeners may have eaten there. It's called the Gramercy Tavern. And it's an incredible place, like the Pixar of the restaurant world. And I was there on a day when Whitney, who had been training for 6 months for this moment, was doing her first shift at the front of the restaurant as a waiter. First time. She'd been training for this moment for 6 months. And right before the doors opened, her manager leaned over and whispered in her ear. I wondered, what did he say? Did he say, I believe in you? You can do it. No, you know what he said? He said, if you
Mhm.
don't ask for your team, if you don't ask for help 10 times today, it's going to be bad. That's what he said. High candor, right? You
Yeah,
basically saying you can plan on screwing up, like, definitely. But think more deeply about that signal. You're going to make a mistake, and I expect that, and that's okay,
right.
right? You're going to make it as your first day, and when you do, don't put your head down. Put your head up and look for help. Ask for
Yeah,
help. Reach
yeah,
out for help. We're here to help you, and it's an incredibly connective signal. It's very real. It's very real, and it's also very connective. Now, he could have been brutally honest. He could have said, "You are going to get crushed today. Like, it's going to be a nightmare." That's brutal honesty, right? But
yeah.
the bar, it's not enough. Brutal honesty is easy, right? Brutal honesty ultimately is just telling what you see. That's not hard to do.
Mm.
So for real leaders and real cultures, it is really important to reinforce, to give that truth within a context of the relationship, which is warm care.
Yeah, yeah. Love that. And definitely encourage our listeners to get the book and read a little bit more about that, because I think our organizations need this so, so much. What I'm seeing right now is either teams where feedback is not being exchanged at all and truth is not being addressed at all. So it's simply not safe to speak truth to anyone. And so people just keep it to themselves, or maybe just to their closest colleagues, or it's being done, as you say, with this brutal honesty, which is absolutely terrible and has a terrible impact on culture. So it's an important skill. And I find this difficult myself. And I've been doing this work for more than 20 years. So it's not like it's intuitive to be warmly candid. But I
No,
think I'm
right.
getting better at it. And so, yeah, and looking forward to getting even better. Obviously, it's a journey.
Well, that pattern that you're describing, that pattern of like, oh, it's so uncomfortable and I'm getting better. That's the same pattern we would use to describe physical exercise, right?
Hmm.
I've been running more. It really, oh God, it's cold.
Hmm.
I hate to go out there, but you know what? I'm getting a little better. That
It's a muscle.
There's so much about culture that is like a muscle. There's so much about culture, especially about communication of this form, this vulnerability, because it will never stop to burn. Like if you like to work out and exercise, you never lose the burn. Like it will always burn. You kind of get used to it though, and you begin to almost enjoy it. And I think that's a phenomenon that happens in good cultures where it always is hard to give that warm, candid feedback, but you start to enjoy the impact it has because you realize you're not turning that person off with your brutal honesty. You're actually flipping them on, and they are, and you can see their improvement and their strength as they try to improve within the bounds of that safe belonging in the group.
Yeah, totally. And it's all about intentions, right? Because obviously, if you come from this place, I want to make this person stronger, then it's easier to do. And yes, it might feel awkward, but eventually it's really making sure that you are not doing this for yourself, just to vent. You are doing this to strengthen someone. And I love this definition that Frances Fry has given us on the show again a few episodes back when she talked about her definition of leadership, which is making others stronger in your presence and ensuring that the impact lasts into your absence. And there's no way of doing it without being warmly candid. I can't see how that can be done. And she also talks about tough love. And that's what warm candor is to me.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
Thanks for sharing that. I also want to ask you a question about what you've mentioned earlier about the bearers of bad news and how our reaction often is to shoot the messenger. And you say, don't shoot the messenger, embrace them.
That's right.
And at a conceptual level, obviously, I get that. And I think a lot of our listeners understand, yes, that's the right thing to do. And yet, in the moment, and sometimes not everyone knows how to be warmly candid, and they might give you the message or the feedback in a way that really hurts.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice? Like, how do you embrace the messenger, even if the message is brutal, even when the message is really bad and you're just getting terrible news?
Yeah. So many of these skills come down to one overarching skill, which is the ability to pause.
Mm.
The ability to pause and
Yes.
not say the first thing that comes into
Yes.
your mind or not attend to the first feeling that comes into your mind. And
Mm-hmm.
beneath pausing is sort of our different systems of attention. We sort of have two ways of paying attention to the world when we really tune into it. One is that spotlight way where it's a very narrow boundary and we're responding to exactly what we sense instantly. And the other is a broader, more diffuse attention where we're looking at the horizon. We're seeing things in context, and what's more slow. It's slow to operate. And I would say when we're in situations like this, when it goes poorly, is when we activate that spotlight system, that narrow bound of attention where this person's attacking me, right? Because it feels like an attack. They said I was terrible at this. They said if I put myself in Whitney's shoes, my manager just told me I was going to screw up 10 times. I've been practicing for 6 months not to screw up, right? I'm not going to screw up.
Mm-hmm.
So she could easily feel attacked. But having the ability to pause and to pay attention to what kind of attention you're paying, which sounds kind of zen, but pay attention.
Very meta.
Are you just in this narrow frame of mind where you are just responding, or are you zoomed out? And to take that second to just zoom out, I think is the cure for the quick negative kind of immune system response to bad feedback. And it's like anything else, the more times you do it, the more times you sort of experience that burn, and then the gain that comes from realizing, oh, now that person is actually, I didn't like that, but they're kind of right.
Mm-hmm.
There's a famous story in the book Radical Candor. Someone gives a presentation to Sheryl Sandberg, who was the boss at the time. Sheryl Sandberg comes up right away and says, "Nice presentation. Did you realize how often you said the word?" And then Sheryl Sandberg referred them to a speaking coach, and they felt horrible. It was their first interaction with their job. But the next time something like that happens, it gets a little, it does get easier, which is when you do pay attention
Yeah.
to the fact this is happening in the bounds. And I guess the other thing that I think of when you ask that question is that it's also up to the leaders and everyone else in a group to continually model gratitude for hard feedback. And so when it happens in that social context, and they can realize that, oh, this is kind of what makes us good, actually. This feels terrible, but I see it around me all the time. This kind of feedback gets given and received with grace, and it's what makes us good. Can be a really powerful place to be.
Yeah, totally. There wouldn't be Boeing or Volkswagen scandals if leaders were
Exactly.
modeling these behaviors. Totally. Oh, I love that. Let's take some time to have a look at part 3 of the Culture Playbook, which is all about
Purpose.
purpose. Yeah, exactly. I was looking for my notes because I actually wanted to read out how you begin this part. I really love this part. You say building a successful culture is like embarking on a wilderness expedition. So you need teamwork, you need stamina, but above all else, you need clarity. And I couldn't agree more with that. And you also say that creating a sense of purpose is not like carving a mission statement into a stone. It's more like building a set of bright spotlights that illuminate the path forward. So what are some of your favorite spotlights? Again, going back to my question of your favorites, what are the most impactful, best spotlights that leaders can put so that they illuminate the path forward?
One of them is kind of at once obvious and not obvious. It's using corny catchphrases. Using corny catchphrases. You would not expect that in great culture, right? You wouldn't think they would have to be corny. You would think, well, their purpose lives in their heart and their mind, and they know what they're about. And in fact, great cultures, you are immersed in corny catchphrases. The Navy SEALs do it all the time. They're always talking about we shoot, move, and communicate, and the only easy day was yesterday, and we're the quiet professionals. They actually like can't shut up about how quiet they are. And the reason why is that those mantras, those catchphrases really do operate as a GPS. I was recently in an event, and again, a big giant mission statement sort of has a little bit of a function there, but in the end, a lot of mission statements sound alike. You could take the mission and purpose statements of the top 500 companies in the world, mix them up randomly, and you would have a really hard time matching the actual mission statement, right? They're all
Yeah,
making the world a better place, and they're all impacting people,
yeah,
and they're all helping families. They're just very, very boring and generic. But what's interesting is when you take that point of view to your microculture, to the people who you work with regularly. And one of the most powerful things you can do is build a mantra map. Come together with a group and talk about, okay, what do we look like at our very best? What problems do we face all the time? And what kind of responses do we want people to have? What's our North Star in this group? Let's name it. And what you'll find is that actually there's probably already language in your group that you use that describes those things and
mhm,
capture that language. We just did one at Microsoft, about a 10-person group. And one of the mantras they came up with was do epic shit. And it was just so goofy and it didn't mean anything to anyone outside of this little group. But to that group, it was
they
incredibly
knew. Yeah.
meaningful. What are we out here to do? We're going to do epic shit. And it
Mhm.
was just so cool to see the energy and orientation that happens when you name something.
Yeah.
A lot of things in culture are relational. Safety and vulnerability and belonging happen in trust. You can't scale those things. Those happen in real relationships.
Mhm.
The one thing you can scale is purpose, though. Purpose as you capture a story and share it. Another effective habit with this is sending a weekly impact note at the end of the week.
I love this one. Yeah. That was one of my favorites one actually in this part of the book. The impact
Oh,
note
it's
is amazing.
it's such a simple thing, but to take time and to say, okay, this week here, there was a medical office that did it, and they would capture patient feedback, and then they would share it back. Nurse Jones was extremely helpful when she helped with my 4-year-old toddler, and share back what is happening. Where did your group have an impact on the larger group or an impact on the world or an impact on each other that is just a one-page bullet point? Here's our bright spots of the week.
Mm-hmm.
And that orients and energizes a group toward what it looks like at its best. And that's one of the
Yeah.
most meaningful things a group can do is define what we look like at our best. And let's talk about the barriers that
Mm-hmm.
stop us from being at our best. And let's continually have pause and have that conversation.
So powerful. I wish we had more time, but I'm mindful of the fact that we're drawing to a close. So we have a section in the show where our listeners can ask questions. We are running this community called Culture Brained. And so I have a couple of questions from two of our members. One is from Marco and the other one is from Shilpa, and they actually ask similar things.
Hi, Daniel. I love the Culture Code, and I can't wait to read the Culture Playbook as well. Going through my notes taken from the Culture Code, I find several references to the power of physical proximity, defined as a connective drug. You write that if you are on a different floor in some orgs, you may as well be in a different country. How much has all this changed after 2 years in the pandemic, with almost no physical proximity, and how will this change in a hybrid world?
My question for Daniel would be, given the increasingly limited opportunities to spend time in close proximity, what can teams do to bond in a similarly powerful way?
What great questions. Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Chopra. Yeah, they're really getting at the heart of what we're navigating right now. And it is, to sort of go to the most basic form, it is incredibly difficult to form deep, meaningful relationships when you are only interacting virtually. I would go so far as to say it's almost impossible to do that, which is why smart groups are finding ways to toggle between physical proximity and in virtual work, and in being very intentional about when we're just trying to be productive, we don't need to be together. But at times where we really need to be creative, we need to be together. It's why places are continually seeking creative ways to lessen that distance and create sort of a simulation of physical proximity, which I guess you might call mental proximity. One of the
Mm-hmm.
ways in which they're doing that is to normalizing conversations around mental health. Other groups are having something called an anxiety party, which I write about a bit in the book, which is where you get
Yeah.
together with the people you work with and you all share something you're anxious about with work. I'm very worried about this relationship or this project. And the group then rates your anxiety from 0 to 5. 0 to 1 or 2 means don't worry about it. 3, 4, 5 means maybe this is deserving of some attention. And then they brainstorm ways to fix the problem. So it's like this virtual little therapy group, maybe you can call it
Yeah.
that, where you're actually sharing. So I think what we're seeing, and I give some other examples of this in the book, but we're seeing is an area of great experimentation in this area as we try to find ways of simulating physical closeness through mental closeness. And some of that, I think, is not magic. It's a question of building a skill set, a new sort of virtual skill set. And as we do, I think the most important element of that skill set, a couple of things, is intentionality, being able to sort of take a pause and say, okay, what is this meeting for? Why are we getting together? What elements can we break out and apart? And so this ability to pause and zoom out and have conversations about what's the best way for us to work together.
Yeah.
Another example, just to throw one more in there, is sort of a
Please do.
user's manual, people sharing users manuals to say, oh, we're going to be working virtually on this project. Here's what you should know about me. I get up really early and I get all my creative work done before 10. And here's what I can't stand. Here's what doesn't work for me. Here's what I hope to bring to this project. Here's what I hope to learn. And you give this sort of quick startup instructions to yourself. And
Mm-hmm.
it shortens that learning curve for the team so that they can get to know each other. So that's to give just a few examples of this sort of family of virtual tools that people are experimenting with.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think I know this is the culture lab, but I think we're all living in a culture lab right now.
Yes.
And so the most important thing we can do in a lab is to pay attention to what works,
Mm-hmm.
pay attention to what doesn't work, and keep exploring.
Absolutely. And for our listeners, if you are curious to see an example of the user's manual or what she calls README document, Yvette Pasqua, previous guest, shared hers. And it's absolutely wonderful. And there are other examples actually in the show notes of that episode. So we will post it in the show notes to this episode so that you can see an example of what that might look like. So final section of the show. It's the rapid fire questions. And I'm going to ask you 5 questions in rapid succession. And the idea is that you will try to answer all 5 in under 2 minutes.
Love it.
Okay, let's go. So what is the sign or perhaps signs in plural that a company culture needs some work or perhaps even a major overhaul?
Lack of laughter. You walk into a room and people are disconnected and not paying attention to each other. How they greet each other. There's a million little signals, but those would be the ones at the top of mind.
Mm-hmm. Are there any companies that you admire for their culture? And if yes, why?
I think the San Antonio Spurs basketball team is pretty remarkable over the course of the years. Their ability to stay connected, to perform at a high level, and to continually explore and add to their family is super impressive. That said, cultures are all alive and they all can fall apart and they all can get better. And so no culture is ever finished. So I can say that right now, but I don't know if I could say that in 2 years.
Yeah. What books on culture, on leadership, or perhaps outside of the genre of business books would you recommend to our listeners?
I would recommend Creativity Incorporated by Ed Catmull. I would recommend Think Again by Adam Grant. And reading a book right now, it's The Lion Tracker's Guide to Life. The Lion Tracker's Guide to Life.
I love the title.
It's very good. It's written by a South African who's lived in the West and lived there as a safari guide. And it just has a beautiful way of kind of the metaphor of tracking a lion really maps nicely onto how people develop in their lives and their careers. And it's not some simple cause and effect like you're building a Lego castle. It's much more interactive. You're sensing patterns of energy and responding to them and tracking. So I'd highly recommend that.
I love it. So final question. Who are amazing people that I should bring as guests on the show?
Oh my gosh. I would say so many. Charles Duhigg, Power of Habit, is an incredible guest. Dave Epstein is really great. He wrote Range. And I'm going to throw in a former Navy SEAL named Jay Hennessy, who now is the head of leadership and development for the Cleveland Guardians, and just a remarkable thinker and leader about culture. He'd be outstanding.
Amazing. And if you know any of them personally and could do a warm intro, that would be amazing.
Done.
Thank you. That's amazing. Okay, so thank you so much. This was absolutely wonderful. Final question, if our listeners want to learn more about you, about your work, get your new book, what are the best places to go to?
Yeah, go to danielcoyle.com, COYLE.
Okay, pretty simple. Thanks again.
Thank you. What a fun time.
I'm Aga Bayer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast, and this is the Culture Lab team.
Production manager, Lindsay Nunez.
Sound producer, Heather McPherson, Twisted Spur Media.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Culture Lab podcast. Dan and I hope that it will inspire you to think broader and deeper about being proactive and about taking a more systemic approach to cultivating and evolving your culture. And if you'd like an opportunity to interact with Dan and other guests of the Culture Lab podcast in live sessions where you can learn more on the topics that we discuss on the show, this is just one of many benefits you'd enjoy if you were a member of the Culture Brained community. Culture Brained is a one-of-a-kind global community for culture leaders who look for new ways of cultivating remarkable cultures in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. If you are in charge of a culture-shaping project, and if you believe that work should be synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, you'd probably feel right at home in our community. It's a diverse group of culture leaders from Fortune 100 to tiny startups on a rapid growth trajectory. And what brings us together is a passion for cultivating a healthy culture at scale. We are guided by our values of being bold, being kind, and being curious. And we'd love for you to join us if it feels like the right fit for you. You can learn more at tiny.one/culturebrained. You'll find the link in the show notes. Thanks for tuning in and listening to this episode of the Culture Lab podcast. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share this episode with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared. If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, you can do it on any podcast streaming platform of your choice. If you want to receive our weekly insights on cultivating a remarkable, powerful, and authentic company culture, especially in a business that scales, type this into your browser: tinyurl.com/agabayer. That's tinyurl.com/AGABAJER. Also, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to it. And finally, the entire Culture Lab team and our guests, we are going to continue exploring how we can make the word work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, and how we can build remarkable cultures that scale as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing. So, what do you want to hear about next? What matters to you? Email us at lindsay@agabayer.com and let us know.